Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv. And, well, today I am here with a compilation of everything. I don't know, definitely not everything. There's like well over 500 episodes of this podcast, but that's because I've been doing it for, as of today, the day this episode comes out, I have been doing this podcast for 7 entire years. And that is honestly the wildest thing in the world. The fact that it's still going, the fact that it is my whole job and I've just become this like well-respected expert on Greek mythology, like it's wild. It's wild. And what that also means though is that today, the day that you're listening to this is also my birthday, because as I say every year, I made the very poor mistake of starting the podcast on my birthday. And so now every time I want to have a celebratory anniversary episode or series, it always falls on my birthday, which just was not the best thought out plan. However, fortunately now I employ the wonderful Michaela, my assistant producer. And Michaela this year has put together just a little compilation of some favorite conversation episodes, some favorite regular episodes, including, I've just seen the list of episodes that she's going to try to pull from. And of course, we have, Seneca's Thyestes. We have Euripides' Iphigenia among the Taurians. And then a handful of others and incredible conversations that I've had in the past year or two. It's just a wonderful combination. I mean, it's just like, honestly, for me, it's just a thrill to have these things pulled together by someone who isn't me, too, because it's like this great reminder of like, oh, I have the coolest job in the whole world, and look at all this cool stuff I've been able to share with you all over the past 7 years. Fucking absolutely wild at this point. But that is about the whole introduction I'm going to give you. By the time I'm recording this, I don't even know what Michaela's pulled. I just know the episodes that she asked me to send files for. So I'm just living in wonderful, wonderful ignorant bliss of whatever the episode is that you are all going to enjoy today on my 36th birthday. Because that's the other thing. The older the podcast gets, the older I get too. Math and chronology is hard sometimes. This is a special anniversary episode. 7 years of Let's Talk About Myths, baby. That's really interesting. Just immediately made me think of all of those ones that are decorated with like the kind of stuff that to me feels so directly linked to symposia. Like, I don't want to just jump straight to like the people playing like Kotobos, but like I love that too. But then all the like erotic decorated stuff where you'd like finish drinking your wine out of this kylix and then there's like just a big dick at the bottom. Like, was that more linked to symposia, or was like that kind of stuff even more broad? Like, was that in just sort of regular people's houses?
Yeah, that's that's actually a really interesting question that I didn't really address. So I mostly I found in general, like when I was looking at the pots, I can't remember off the top of my head now because it's so long ago that I wrote that chapter, what specific kinds of parameters I used for the because of course there are lots and lots of different kinds of scenes, as you've already mentioned. Some that I didn't just lay it out
by dicks.
Yeah,
like, weird that in your dissertation you didn't say like how many normal people had dicks on the bottom of their glasses.
But yeah. So I think actually the thing that I focused on were depictions of symposia on, or what we think are symposia on, vases. So of course, yes, there are lots and lots of different kinds of decoration, of various scenes, various images that I think would be an interesting project, in the realm of the of drinking, Greek drinking, to think about like the distribution of those images too, in the same way that I was thinking about distribution of shape, because right, I was looking at the distribution of a very specific type of scene, so scenes of people drinking together. But yeah, that would be really interesting to kind of add on to that, with thinking about these different kinds of scenes and thinking, are certain types of scenes particularly in demand in these different contexts, because if we tend to associate those, like traditionally those various scenes or some scenes with all male drinking parties, right? It would be so cool to see, like, this vase that has a dick on the inside of the cup, right? That could be like found somewhere else in like a house that like, or anywhere, that you're like, oh wow, like what were they doing in this house?
Yeah, I just like the idea of it being like a really normal family home of just like, like a husband and wife, maybe a couple of kids, and like all of their pottery is like weirdly erotic because I don't know, maybe they ended up with it or something. I don't know. I just like, because obviously I'm not coming at any of this from a scholarship perspective. I just like encounter all of it in so many different ways. And so I'm just always in awe of the stuff that they put on pottery so specifically, because like some of it's the most beautiful, like mythological scenes, storytelling. And then some of it's like the most bizarre sex scene ever. And you're just like, well, that's just on a glass. Like, why not? I'm using the word glass loosely, but so like you were looking at shapes then too. So I mean, like I know like a handful of shapes from, again, my like minimal research, but is there like certain types that were like maybe a bit more like normal, for everyday people versus like a from a fancier party kind of perspective?
I think broadly, I was trying to look at patterns of consumption of different traditionally sympathetic shapes in in Athens versus because as you mentioned before, right, Athens is kind of like the center of all of this evidence we have for the symposium, and I wanted to compare that to somewhere that's not Athens, so I worked on a lot of material from the site of Olympos in northern Greece. And broadly speaking, I think the types of shapes that they were consuming was very different, like was in general quite different from what we tend to see in Athens, which initially I thought maybe it was because like they just were not drinking in the same way as, I mean, and they probably weren't, but the main thing that I noticed was that like kylakes, these stemmed cups, are not very common in northern Greece in general, and that may be because they're not using them as frequently as we assume they are used in Greek symposia, or it could be a chronological issue where most of the evidence that we have of people drinking from kylakes in Athens is from the 5th century, whereas in the 4th century it goes out of kind of fashion. It goes out of fashion. There's not as many of them being produced even in Athens. So it's possible that because Olympus is a little bit of a later site, they're not using those kinds of cups anymore. They're not producing them. They're not importing them either, because no one is making them. So that's kind of the broad pattern that I noticed. In terms of what kinds of shapes are found kind of in spaces that are more characteristically sympathetic versus not, I think the distribution was pretty even. Like in terms of the different shapes that I was looking at, I looked at, I think numbers evade me, but at least 5 or 6 different types of shapes, including craters. So mix the big mixing bowls for wine, and that was really interesting. And that like I looked at decorated craters. I looked at just plain black gloss ones, and there were a few undecorated ones, and tried to see if I could match those up with different kinds of space. And that also was not as clear as one might expect, right? If you are looking for a sympathetic space, you might expect to find a crater, but sometimes there isn't one, even though like the architecture might suggest that this space was used that way. So that raises questions of like, in the case where you don't have a crater in a clearly architecturally distinct sympathetic space, what are they like they must be mixing their wine with water somehow. So what are they using? Maybe a metal vessel. That tends to be the traditional interpretation. But we don't have evidence of them. So like how can we know for sure? And then the opposite, thinking about, if everyone is drinking wine, as we all tend to expect, if there's no crater in like a normal house, but they have drinking vessels, what are they mixing their wine with? Or even, you can go even further. And as I did start thinking about this, like, are they mixing their wine at all? Right?
Yeah.
Like, there's no reason why they have to.
Are they super drunk?
Yeah, right? Yeah. So maybe they would be the ones that have the more erotic paintings in their house. Who knows?
The fun ones. Mm-hmm. That reminds me of like that quote from like that. It's a fragment of like Eubulos, I think, right? Do you know the one I'm talking about, where he talks about like, it's a quote from Dionysus talking about like the levels of getting drunk during a party.
Yeah.
Like how much wine you're mixing. I just those kinds of things fill me with such joy. Of like just the way they talked about just drinking culture, I guess, is like this deeply normal thing. Like, I don't know. It's so fun kind of in comparison to like a North American kind of mentality where like obviously drinking is like really common, but it still has there's like a very different mentality over like, of course we drink because it's like how we hydrate ourselves, except it's just usually wine and like maybe there's water in there. Like, it's just, I don't know. It's so fun. I just am always fascinated by the volume of these shapes. And I think, somebody like me who's just coming across this stuff, like random stuff I'm reading or like, museums and things, like you tend to think of like the fancier stuff. Right. And so the piece that's just coming to my mind. So I would just be curious to know if they're like common or totally rare, because they seem like they have to be rare, is like those super, like the animal shaped rhytons. I don't know what the correct plural of rhyton is, but like and like you're holding like a goat head that's actually a drinking glass, but like you can't really set it down because it needs like a base that it doesn't have. Like, do we think those were common? Do you know, or are they just so impractical they had to have been for like very special occasions?
I did. I wrote a term paper many years ago on Raita. I think the plural is Raita with an A.
That sounds right.
Specifically, the Attic ones that are shaped like animals. And I think, I'm trying to remember, I think it's there's a person, I don't want to get their name wrong, but I think it's Miller. She wrote a book on like Athens and Persia, and like the influence of like Persian culture on Athens, and specifically looked at like various aspects of Athenian culture. But I remember there being a chapter, or at least a section specifically about Attic Raita, and how that like transformation was achieved. So like these animal-headed cups come from like Persian culture, and generally the same region, and they're made originally in like precious metals like silver, but they are like adopted into the Athenian repertoire of vessels, and that's kind of how they come to be. But they're different, right? Like they are traditionally not meant to be set down, and we have also examples from earlier periods in the Bronze Age as well. But the ones in Athens, most of them they do have a handle, right, to make it easier to pick them up. And they do often have a base on them because, again, right, they need to be drank or used in these very specific contexts that, require like reclining and on whatever kind of furniture, maybe a couch, maybe a mattress on the ground, what have you. And they're all also often tables, right? So you need to set your cup down as you would with any other kind of cup. But I do not know how common they are. I don't think they are very common. Although every time I go to a museum, I always find another one, which is wild. And they're all different shapes, which is like, are there any repeat shapes? That would be something interesting to know. But from my perspective of like looking at so many different shapes that are like really common, and even some that like don't seem to be very common, like a bull saw. Like most people do not know what a bull saw is. They've probably never heard of it.
Yep.
But they are very common in the 4th century, so it's like they just kind of appear. But Raita, I don't think are very common, and it would be interesting to look into that shape, and figure out, first of all, like why did they want to make this shape in the first place. The range of animals or other kinds of images, because I mean there are also some that are like in the shape of human heads too. Like there's one that I can remember that's like Dionysus's face and a satyr's face and things like that, that are also vessels. And then so the range of shapes, and then also just like how many are there just out there, like, and the contexts that they've been found in, because that would probably help us get a sense of, if they're found in graves, maybe they weren't used very frequently. But if they're found in settlements, that might suggest that they were actually used in these various drinking parties. What kinds of drinking parties, we wouldn't really necessarily be able to tell, but yeah, that would definitely be something interesting to look into. I don't know if anyone's done that research. I'm sure there's someone out there that has noticed and maybe done something with it, but if not, I mean, that would be a really, really interesting project.
Yeah, I mean, they're just so pretty too, and like I'm glad you mentioned the Bronze Age ones too, because that's what I was gonna bring up when you said that, that the Attic ones kind of come from Persia, because that's really interesting that they come from Persia. Because I think of a lot of the ones that I've seen, in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, but I also think of the ones that are on Crete, like in the Heraclean Museum, because those are really interesting, like because they have like the bull's head right on, that's really popular, to the point where I did get it tattooed on me, which is why I think of it. But like it's like just a full-blown statue of bull's head, and then you have to like actually know that it's a Raiton, because no part of it, just looking at it, can you even like see where you drink from, which I love. Because it's like whatever the angles are that it's positioned, like you can't tell that is a good drinking vessel. It's just a bull's head statue, and then you're like, wait, we drink from that? What?
I think I think the topic is definitely more complicated than just like, I mean, I did just say that like the idea, probably like the inspiration probably came from Persia, or somewhere in that region, but that's in the 5th century, right? Like that's just like one proposition, whereas definitely we have animal headed cups called Raita already in the Bronze Age in Greece. They do look very different. There are more similarities, I think, between like the Attic ones of the 5th century and like Persian vessels, versus between Athens and the Bronze Age. So the idea definitely was there, but like, I mean, like I said, someone who knows more probably has made this connection already and like can explain it better than I can. But I think that's a really good point. And I actually had students this semester have to write about like in like detail and like analyze the bull's head Raiton from Crete, from Knossos, and like so many of them were like talking about like where the openings were in it, and I was like, I had no idea, because I've never looked at it that closely, but like I think one of the openings like in the chin, which is wild to me, because like you can't see it in any of the photos that you ever look at, but there's one in the chin, and I think there's one like on like in the head, at the top of the head somewhere.
That's what I would have assumed too, because you can't see it from like the angle that it's displayed or the photos. No, and like to be clear, I'm not trying to like put you on the spot with the Persia thing. I think it's really interesting because you're right, like, and what listeners might not know, but like the ones on Crete that look like a bull head, because there's a couple of them I know, like I think one though is in the National Archaeological Museum, but they do look really different. Like they don't look like drinking vessels, whereas the Attic ones, like it might be like a donkey's head in a really fun way, but it is very clearly like it has a handle, where to hold it. It again would still be very impractical to put down, I think, but like, and very top heavy, but you can tell obviously that it's a drinking vessel. So it's like they are quite different. And then when you mentioned the heads thing too, like that reminded me, there's a lot of those ones, or I don't know if there's a lot, but I know I've seen like there's very famous pictures of the ones where it's like they've depicted people from Africa too, and they've got like really interesting kind of, I don't know, just like get their like kind of exploration on like people that they've encountered with, and then it's kind of stuff that I feel like when you look at it now, sometimes something about it screams racist.
Yeah.
But I'm like, I know that it probably wasn't, because it's the context to us that makes it seem like it should be. I don't even know, but I'm sure you know the ones I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I think honestly, like I've heard many talks about this, and I know like there are people out there that have done more research into this, and that have like done like really good research into this. Like I think Naji Olia at William and Mary, he has, I think his dissertation was on a lot of this kind of topic, and so he probably looked very closely into this. I'm very bad at reading people's dissertations because I don't even want to read mine. But
I've never read one, so there's literally no judgment here, to be very clear.
But like he is definitely a person that I think like that comes to mind when I think of like vase painting and depictions of Africans in art in antiquity. But like I said, there are several people that I can think of that have done that kind of research, and I mean it is really interesting to like think about, because yes, there are some specific things that come to mind for us, like like it's like, oh, that's shocking and like kind of racist, but also like if we think about it like in the context of like what was happening in antiquity and like what their experiences were, like it may be a little bit different from what we immediately think of, but yeah, there's some interesting nuance there, for sure.
Yeah, it feels to me that like, and I don't, I'm not gonna make that this whole topic obviously, but like it feels to me that the things that would make us, like specifically as North Americans, but I think generally as like the Western countries that were like involved in slavery, like that there are the things that make it, that those look racist are like the things that have been created in the last like 500 to 600 years that then are racist now, but like obviously weren't back then. So it's just really interesting to kind of, I don't know, think about that stuff broadly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just the idea that they were like making drinking vessels out of like heads, be they human or animal. They were just weirdly creative with pottery in a way that is so interesting. And like the head ones too, I think they're like often double-sided. There's like a face on each side. Anyway, sorry, now I'm just like constantly just like imagining all the different things.
I think my favorite Raiton that I've ever seen, and I can't remember where I saw it, but there was one that I saw that was in the shape of a lobster claw, and that was very cool to me.
I mean, they just made some really weird pottery back then, and I love them for it. Alone on the stage now, with both brothers and the two boys having gone into the palace, the chorus goes on. They wonder what god was able to achieve this after such strife. They tell the audience that just before Thyestes returned, all of Mycenae was preparing for a civil war, that the citizens were preparing, the men preparing to head to battle if they had to, even though their weapons were old and rusty from so many years of peace. They were mending the palace, the walls of the city, just preparing for the worst. And yet, now, the chorus determines there was no need for them to panic. Atreus and Thyestes will not be fighting. There will be no violence that they'd all expected. All is going to be well. There's still going to be peace in Mycenae, only now a real and much better peace between brothers. The chorus sings of change, how nothing lasts, not the good or the bad. Everything is fleeting, and everything strong eventually becomes weak. Quote, no one should trust too much in his good fortune. No one should give up hope of better luck. Clotho mixes good with bad and stops fortune from standing still. Each man's fate rolls around. The chorus makes it very clear. The fates, Clotho among them, don't work for anyone. Fortune can turn when you least expect it. And of course, this isn't just a song for the sake of it. It's a cue. When the chorus finishes their song, a messenger arrives on the stage. He sets the mood immediately, calling out to the sky, asking what possible wind could come and just sweep him away. encase him in clouds, to, quote, tear my eyes away from such abomination. This house would make blush even Pelops and Tantalus. It's happened, then. We know it, the audience would know it, but it's the chorus who's yet to understand exactly what has happened in the house of Atreus to their royal family. And frankly, even we and the audience could never have imagined how Seneca will have made it happen. The messenger is not all right. He's messy. He's unsure of where he is. He's shaken up by what he knows. He asks the chorus where he is, though surely he knows. What he wants to know is how something like this could happen in a place like Mycenae. Maybe somehow he's ended up somewhere else, in some barbarian land of the east where something like this could even happen. That's right, they've got to throw in just a hint of xenophobia for good measure, but no. Messenger, this is very much still Mycenae. This is a very Greek thing to do. The chorus tries to drag the news out of him. He's talking in riddles, seeking any means of just not being there, not holding on to this news. But finally he relents, and he tells them what he knows. The speech I read before the episode began, that's how the messenger opens his speech to the chorus. He tells them about this secret space attached to the palace. It's an ancient grove, hidden away, so hidden that it isn't reached by the palace servants. No one touches the trees there. They grow wild. It's there that the line of Tantalus takes up their reign over the city. It's there that they go for guidance when things look bad. The grove holds mementos of the past. The trumpet that started the race between Pelops and Oenomaus hangs from a tree. So does the latter's broken chariot, the cause of his death, and the reason Pelops was able to marry his wife, Hippodamia, how they could go on to have their two sons, Atreus and Thyestes. The tree holds the whole family history. It even holds the remnants of Pelops' eastern origins, the hat or headdress that he wore before he came to Greece and reigned over Mycenae. There in the grove, there's also a dark spring. Quote, a black and stagnant pool, most like the ugly water of terrible Styx, by which the gods swear faith. A dismal spring starts forth beneath the shadow, and a sluggish black pool creeps along. Such are the ugly waters of dread Styx, on which the gods take oath. It's said that from this place in the dark night the gods of death make moan. With clanking chains the grove resounds, and the ghosts howl mournfully. Whatever is dreadful but to hear of, there is seen. Throngs of the long-since dead come forth from their ancient tombs and walk abroad, and creatures more monstrous than men have known spring from the place. Nay, more, through all the wood flames go flickering, and the lofty beams glow without the help of fire. Often the grove re-echoes with three-throated bayings. Often the house is affrighted with huge ghostly shapes. Nor is terror allayed by day. The grove is night unto itself, and the horror of the underworld reigns even at midday. From this spot sure responses are given to those who seek oracles. With thundering noise the fates are uttered from the shrine, and the cavern roars when the god sends forth his voice. The messenger goes on in his description of this place. It is both sacred, vital to the kingdom of Mycenae, and where the kings go to feel connected to their land. And it is dark and dreary and ominous, and frankly just screams for horrific things to happen in it. He tells the chorus that rumors say that sounds are heard from the grove, the groans of spirits at night. Quote, all things that make one shudder even to hear are made visible. He says that in the grove, tombs burst open and from them the living dead escape. Flames sparkle, though nothing burns. Phantoms curse the space. The light of day doesn't even reach this grove. It's as though it is perpetually night. This is where Atreus brought Thyestes' 2 children. The messenger goes on to tell the chorus. Quote, "The altars are adorned. How can I say this? The little princes have their hands tied back. He binds their poor little heads with a purple band." The messenger goes on to explain how Atreus did it. Not just the act itself, but what it meant. This wasn't just a killing. It wasn't just murder. It was a sacrifice. Atreus turned it into a ritualistic killing. He set it up as though they weren't children that he was killing, but some beast meant for slaughter. Incense burned, wine was poured in libation. Quote, "All due ritual was observed in case such a horrible crime can be done properly." The chorus asks the messenger just, who was holding the knife? I can't help but quote a longer passage here. So this is the Miller translation. "He is priest himself. He, with baleful prayer, chants the death song with boisterous utterance. He stands by the altar. He handles those doomed to death, sets them in order, and lays hand upon the knife. Himself attends to all. No part of the sacred rite is left undone. The grove begins to tremble. The whole palace sways from the quaking earth, uncertain where to fling its weight, and seems to waver. From the left quarter of the sky rushes a star, dragging a murky trail. The wine poured upon the fire changes from wine and flows as blood. From the king's head falls the crown twice, and again the ivory statues in the temples weep. These portents moved all, but Atreus alone, true to his purpose, stands and even scares the threatening gods. Even the grove doesn't want Atreus to do what he is going to do. Even nature and the gods are recoiling at what this man is planning. All of these details that the messenger provides are meant to emphasize in the strongest possible terms just what a crime this is. It is beyond the pale. It's unimaginable. It is quite literally the worst thing a person could do. Everyone knows it, and yet Atreus just keeps going. Even his crown, the symbol of his rulership over Mycenae, doesn't stay on his head as he does this. Even it is revolting from his touch. The messenger continues. He tells the chorus that in that moment, Atreus stood looking at the boys. He stared at them, flitting between the two. Quote from the Wilson again. "He wonders which to slaughter first and which to butcher second. It makes no difference, but he ponders and enjoys order in brutality." When the chorus asked, the messenger told them it was Tantalus Jr. that he killed first. And this is Seneca. So the chorus then asks the messenger to explain how the boy looked when he was murdered by his uncle. He stood strong, he tells them. He didn't waste words trying to plead for his life before Atreus plunged his sword into the boy's body. It wasn't instantaneous, but eventually the boy's body collapsed back onto Atreus, and then he did the same to Thyestes, dragging him to the altar and sacrificing him like an animal, cutting off his head and letting it fall to the ground. But he wasn't done. Atreus was mad with rage, completely overcome and lost in his own fury. Quote, holding out the sword drenched in the two boys' blood, careless where his fury leads him cruelly, he drives the blade into the chest of the child, right through. And the blood that poured from the boys put out the fires that surrounded them. And when the chorus screams out in horror, calling the act one of savagery, the messenger asks them, "Did you think that would be it? If that was the case, Atreus would be almost divine." No, the messenger tells the chorus, that was just the first step in Atreus's crimes. Oh, crime incredible to any age, which coming generations will deny. Torn from the still living breasts, the vitals quiver, the lungs still breathe, and the fluttering heart still beats. But he handles the organs and inquires the fates, and notes the markings of the still warm entrails. When he has satisfied himself with the victims, he is now free to prepare his brother's banquet. With his own hands he cuts the body into parts, severs the broad shoulders at the trunk, and cuts through the arms, heartlessly strips off the flesh and severs the bones. The heads only he saves, and the hands that had been given to him in pledge of faith. Some of the flesh is fixed on spits, and set before slow fires, hangs dripping. Other parts boiling waters tosses in heated kettles. The fire overleaps the feast that is set before it, and twice and again thrown back upon the shuddering hearth and forced to tarry there, burns grudgingly. The liver sputters on the spits, nor could I well say whether the bodies or the flames made louder groans. The fire dies down in pitchy smoke, and the smoke itself, a gloomy and heavy smudge, does not rise straight up and lift itself in air upon the household gods themselves. In disfiguring cloud it settles. Did I need to read you all that incredibly graphic scene, one that I think I could convincingly argue is the most horrific scene of all ancient tragedy? No, I did not need to do that, but gods, did I want to. This play is so fucked up. Should I feel badly over how much I love it? Because I don't. When the chorus asks the messenger what it was that Atreus did next, did he dare refuse burial to the corpses? Because that is the worst thing that they can think of. Refusing burial. No, the messenger says, I wish he'd left them on the earth to rot. That would be a mercy. And he goes on detailing everything that Atreus did to the children in the speech that I just read. And now that's not even the full speech. I just couldn't even justify quoting anymore. But he does go on. He calls to the sun itself, saying it's set too late to stop what was going to happen. Quote, the father rips apart his sons, putting into his murderous mouth his own dear flesh and blood. His hair is wet and shiny with perfume, his body heavy with wine. His mouth is overstuffed, his jaws can hardly hold new morsels. Oh, Thyestes, the messenger goes on, you are lucky to be ignorant of what you've just done. It's too bad that the day even had to begin at all. If only the sun could take it back, hide all of the horrific crimes under this cover of darkness. Quote, but we must see this evil. All is now revealed. With all of this news now forced on them, all of the horror of Atreus' vengeance revealed, the chorus sings. They sing of darkness, literal and metaphorical. They sing of the darkness that has descended on the kingdom of Mycenae. It is as though day has turned to night. And what it takes for the gods to cause such a thing has the chariot gone off its track? How does that happen? Quote, is Hell's dungeon opened to reveal the conquered giants in a new attempt at war? They go on, they ask if the punished Thyestes has healed his wounds and his rage has been restored. They ask if Typhon has freed himself, if he is stretching all of his limbs into the air. Have those who were vanquished on the Phlegrean field, where the gods fought those giants, have they returned and forced the mountains from their prison gates? Does this mark an end to dawn and dusk? They say that the sun, as he was setting into the west, has been surprised by the dawn. Everything is wrong. The world is off its kilter. The crimes that have just been committed are so horrible that nothing can remain as it was. The earth might as well have stopped spinning. It is not something one worries lightly that the gods will or already have abandoned humanity entirely because of what Atreus has done. The chorus of Mycenaeans fear that this might mean the end of everything, that the world itself will collapse into chaos, the sea might swallow the earth, that the sun will never shine again, the moon will never shine, and the night day, quote, the mass of gods will be heaped away into a single chasm. They wonder if the constellations of the zodiac and beyond will change their shape, if they will be lost entirely. Quote, we were born for a cruel lot, whether we, poor things, have lost the sun or forced him into exile. And then Atreus returns to the stage, and gods, is he proud of himself.
Yes, I love Helen in the Odyssey. I love that she uses magic and drugs and generally, and I think that brings to the surface something that's always potentially there, and that is that her beauty is a superpower, but the dangerous power of beauty is often conceptualized as being magic, or like a drug that overcomes poor, helpless, pathetic man, right? so they can't function properly. And in the Odyssey, you really see that brought out with the drug she administers in the drink at the party, at the dinner party, and with my favorite moment is when she basically betrays the Greeks, when the Greeks are hiding in the Trojan horse, and she walks around and mimics the voices of their wives. And obviously, this is magic, right? So they all want to jump out because they think their wives are there. I mean, that's crazy, and it's obviously supernatural.
Yeah.
So I really like that. I do think there's is some continuity between that and the Iliad. And the continuity in my mind is that I think in the Iliad, she's also quite manipulative. It's not presented as magic, but she does all this woe is me, I'm a terrible woman thing. She does that in the Odyssey as well. Bitch Helen, or whatever you want to call her, dogface. It's the Greek for dogface, the word that's used for Helen, which means basically slut.
Yeah.
And so she's putting herself down, saying like, oh, I'm so terrible. But to the patriarchal Greek male audience, that's a sign of a good woman, because a good woman is one who puts herself down. So I think, I mean, we can't talk about what Helen is really thinking because she's not a real person, but I think that kind of rhetoric of talking about what a terrible person she is also a way of manipulating men. And you'll notice that in the Iliad, the men she does it to, namely Hector and, who else does she do it? Hector and Priam, those are the two she does it to. They both really like her, and they're like, oh, Helen, it's not your fault. So I view that as an example of successful manipulation of men by a woman who's in a, obviously, many ways, subordinate position.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that interpretation quite a lot. I feel like I probably read it more at face value when I went through it, which was so many years ago now on the podcast. But I love the idea that she's doing it all on purpose and knows exactly what she's doing and what she's going to get out of it.
She's a very self-aware character in Homer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's that bit where she's weaving a tapestry of which shows the Trojan War, and that's kind of a metaphor for her self-awareness about the war and her role in it.
Right. Oh, I need to reread the Iliad. I can't wait for the new Emily Wilson translation. I think that's going to be my time to to revisit it after a while. There's just so much to say about Helen. She's so fascinating. So now my knowledge of her in pop culture in movies is Troy, but I know obviously you're talking about other representations of her. So like what exists out there otherwise, and you know how did you feel about it?
Well, I started with Troy for the reasons I've already given.
Mm-hmm.
And what that got me interested in was, how do you represent beauty?
Hmm.
And clearly there's a big difference between doing that in writing or in a text and doing it on screen. And on screen is going to be a real challenge. So I'm like, if you have a character who's the most beautiful woman in the world, how are you going to show her on screen? Mm-hmm. And I started with Diane Kruger being a really bad example. But that got me into like looking at other examples. And I ended up with about half a dozen. I restricted it to Hollywood just because there are so many and I wanted to have some kind of a connection between them. Mm-hmm. The first one is one of my favorites, and that's a 1927 silent film. I'll just tell you what they all are, and then we'll go back and talk about them, whichever ones you want. But she's one of my favorites. Then after that, and I have a whole first chapter that's about early Hollywood and their attitudes towards beauty and representations of like Venus and so on. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is that's 1927, The Private Life of Helen of Troy. After that, I have 2 epics. And the first is a 1950s epic called Helen of Troy. And the second is Troy. And honestly, those are both my least favorites. Then I moved to television, which I really did enjoy. I like doing the television part. There's an episode of Star Trek, the original series, which is about Helen. It's called Elan of Troyes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I know, right?
That's amazing.
And then I paired that with an episode of Xena Warrior Princess, just to compare.
Yeah.
And then there's a TV miniseries from 2003, which was made at the same time as Troy, which I kind of love. I mean, it was a big flop. It was presented as a kind of a TV special event miniseries extravaganza, and it was panned. But I think the reason it got panned is because it's really aimed at teenage girls. And so that became one of my favorites as well. So I can talk about whichever ones you like.
Well, I mean, I have to admit, I am most intrigued by the idea of one being aimed at teenage girls, not least because I think that, you know, it really says something that it gets panned, and that's kind of the connection, and it just doesn't surprise me at all, especially as someone who was 15 in 2003, and so like I feel like I lived this, and I'd love to hear about that one.
Yeah, you could have lived this. Well, the initial problem, actually, I did an interview with the person who wrote it, and which was really interesting. It was about what it's like to be a woman writer in Hollywood, and she said she started out doing full-length movies, and they never got made, so she moved to television because it was more female-friendly. And this is going to come out, it's going to be published, the interview is going to be published in a book called Women Writers and the Classics, or something like that.
Well, now I need that book, thank you.
In a year or two. It's not it's on its way. Anyway, so that was super interesting. And she did various TV miniseries about historical and mythological women, and from a feminist point of view. And most of them, she said, didn't even get made. But this one did. And she was disappointed at how much of her intention was taken out of it. But I still thought it came out pretty well. There was a problem with the conflict of genre and content. So the genre is quote unquote epic, which people think of as big fights and special effects, and you normally think of a male hero, right? For an epic. It's because the whole concept of a hero is one that's hard to apply to women in most eras of society.
Especially 2003. Like that's a very specific time period for women and young women.
Yes. And I put it in that context too, the post-feminist context. Although the person who wrote it, Ronnie Kern, is the writer, and she was definitely a second wave feminist. But in 2003, we had third wave feminism, so-called. I really don't like the waves thing, but yeah.
Yeah, I can't say I know much about them, even though like my career is as a feminist, but I just kind of broadly say
and
that.
So-called post-feminism.
Oh gosh,
all that stuff. Just as a sidebar, I have a personal thing about the idea of that feminism or anything else comes in generations, because I think it's used to pit people against each other. So it's like, boomers are bad because they're old school, and new up and coming kids are better because they have new fresh ideas. Well, back in the day, the boomers were the ones who were having the fresh ideas. In other words, it's not about generations, it's about attitude and mentality. Anyway, that's just me.
No, I agree entirely. I think that's important to say too.
It's a way of putting people against each other, divide and conquer.
Yeah, and as if that's not like the exact opposite point of feminism, which, especially today, we already have a problem of a subset of quote unquote feminism that is, pitting against other people. And it's just like, we don't need more of that.
We don't. Yes. No. So we're on the same page here.
Yeah.
So anyway, we had this epic framework with this expectation of masculine heroism and all of that, which also it was it's a 2-episode miniseries, so it's really more like a long film, and it was promoted that way too, as this great epic extravaganza. But the story and the sympathy focuses on the figure of Helen, and she's represented as a really kind of, at the beginning, a clueless teenage girl, very childish. It's a childish romance with Paris. I mean, the film validates it, but it's very heavily romanticized. For instance, when they first meet, he sees a vision of her at the Judgment of Paris, and she sees a vision of him in the magic pond in the mountains. It's very girlish stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then off she goes to Troy, etc. But I read a lot of reviews and responses, and it was trashed over and over again for being essentially too feminine and quote unquote not the Iliad.
Yeah, because Troy is the Iliad. God.
Right, exactly. And Ronnie Kern, who wrote it, was explicitly not basing it on the Iliad. Yeah. She included the abduction by Theseus, who you mentioned earlier.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah,
I can't believe I did not know this thing existed. I am now obsessed.
Well, tell me what you think when you watch it.
I will. I can't believe Theseus is in there. So
yes,
so I feel like that is a thing. Like it's. So the running joke on my show is that like I'm just like a Theseus hate hour. It's really not. I mean, it is true, but like it's obviously not in every episode. But I do think it is fun to talk about how bad Theseus is as a hero, because he's just so bad. And I think the number one example, anytime I have this, people like to argue Jason or Theseus, like who's the worst. And for me, it's like, well, only one of them kidnapped a girl who was at the oldest 12. So I think it was Theseus. So I'm just, but I feel like that is so often like left out of things because it does make a man look bad. So I'm fascinated by the idea that it actually appears in pop culture.
Yes. Now they do soften him up a lot. It's sort of like a frat boy prank.
God, okay.
And then he turns into a nice guy. He never actually has sex with her.
Well, I guess that's true to the myth, but it's because he was like off trying to abduct the queen of the underworld instead. But
well, right, and they allude to that too.
Really?
Yeah, because what's his name? What's his boyfriend's name? Pirithous is on his way to the underworld.
Wow.
Yeah. So he does turn into a good guy, but the point is the story. She's telling the writer is telling the story of Helen, so she includes all this stuff that's about Helen that's not necessarily the Trojan War, and so all these people are complaining. And I'm looking at a lot of IMDb comments. They're complaining that it's not Homer, it's not the Iliad. Right. And then this most awesome thing for me was I found on IMDb a set of about 70 responses that were written by teenage girls. And that was because their teacher had given them an assignment to write an IMDb review.
Oh my gosh.
I know. The main negative is that they were Filipina, and no offense, but they're not, Hollywood American target audience. So that was a problem. But I thought I could use them because they're natives. They're very good speakers of English. They were educated in English, and they're teenage girls, Anyway, they love this film. They all were in love with Paris, who's this like cute boy.
Yeah.
which was very sweet. They kind of raved about his beauty. And interestingly, whereas usually in most reviews of most Helen movies, you're going to get guys basically measuring her beauty,
Yeah.
whether they think she's beautiful enough, and they're usually making jokes about the face that launched 1,000 ships, and they'll say things like, she's more like the face that launched 1,000 lunches, or launched one canoe, and etc.
Yeah.
And these girls don't talk at all about what she looks like.
Yeah.
They're 15-year-olds. They're about the age you were.
Yeah.
And they just go goo-goo over Paris and how hot he is. And the whole romantic message of love and its importance is really resonating with them. So that's the basis for my argument, that it's aimed at teenage girls. And if you take it that way, it's a successful movie. It's just that it fell flat and was scorned by, the guardians of high culture and by people who think an epic should be a masculinist adventure.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. It makes me think of how some things are framed today, specifically when it comes to classical reception, because it sounds like the issue was more about marketing than it was about the actual show, right? It's interesting that it's from 2003 too, because that was really like the height of, and maybe I'm biased because I was 15 then, but like it was kind of the height of teenage girl movies. I would say it's all because of Kirsten Dunst for the most part. But it was. And so it's interesting to me that that it would get panned like that. And it does sound like it was more about marketing than anything else, because it's like, no one's watching like Bring It On because they thought it was an epic, what you're getting. But if it is marketed like an epic, you're going to get that. And it comes up a lot these days, I think, in retellings, books of classical reception retellings, because so often the buzzword is feminism. So, it's a feminist retelling of a myth. And quite often with a good handful of the new ones that are coming out now, they're not feminist retellings. They're just retellings that focus on women.
Yeah.
But the marketing gets to call them feminist, and then, people get mad about that. It's like, well, it's actually not the author's fault unless the author's part of it. But more often than not, it's the marketing that wants the buzzword of feminism, even if the author's not trying to write a feminist retelling. And it's interesting the way those things can really affect a piece of art, but also just, I guess it's the way they kind of really tie in to feminism broadly, I suppose. Just this idea that stuff has to be for women, and if it isn't marketed that way, then it's wrong, or if it's marketed as feminist and it's not, or I don't know. I don't really have a full thought on this, but it's really interesting to see those kind of parallels.
Yes, and it opens the door to people's very different views of what feminism is. Is it a feminist retelling if it shows the women suffering? Or does it have to show the women having agency and taking action? It depends on what you think counts as feminist. And in the case of this movie as well, part of the problem is not just marketing, it's the fact that the film wouldn't get made without the marketing. It can only get made as a TV epic, because that's the only way that a studio is going to make a show about the ancient world. Right.
Yeah, it makes me think there was a few ancient world TV miniseries from around that time. Like there was a Jason and the Argonauts one, and then there was the brief, it's kind of like a section of the Odyssey, but I feel like that was more in the late 90s. But it was sort of a time for that. It's just interesting the way there was kind of like a little collection of them. There
was a wave of them.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I interrupted you just then.
No.
There was a wave of them late 90s and to the last few years of the 20th century. And if you look at my book, just to promote it for a minute, I have a little chart which shows audience responses. And out of those miniseries, 2 of them were named for women, Helen and Cleopatra. And I did I'm not really a statistician by any means, but I did a little analysis of the audience reactions, and the 2 which have female names and female protagonists were much more popular with women, obviously. But they were downplayed and dissed overall, because shows that are popular with women tend to be disliked by men, and men are more, you probably know this, but more ungenerous towards shows about women. Women will put up with shows about men, but
Because we've been forced to.
Yeah, exactly. So the numbers tell the tale, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, none of those films is that great.
No.
But I think mine, the one I call it mine, my one, is as good as any and maybe better than most.
Mm-hmm. And is it just called Helen of Troy? It's
called Helen of Troy. It's available on DVD.
Is it great? I'm going to go find it. I'm really excited about this.
I think you can actually watch it on YouTube, the whole thing.
Oh, great. Yeah. Oh, I can't believe I missed it, honestly, because I was also, I mean, I've been a nerd for the ancient world for a very long time, so I'm surprised that I missed out, and I'm excited to find it now.
Well, by many criteria, it's pretty trashy, so, that's what you'd expect. But I have a fondness for it, and I think you'll enjoy reading what my teenage girls had to say about it.
Yes.
In the book.
Yeah. Call it violence, if you like. Such violence is pleasing to the fair. They often wish, through compulsion, to grant what they are delighted to grant. Whatever fair one has been despoiled by the sudden violence of passion, she is delighted at it, and the chief is as good as a godsend. But she who, when she might have been carried by storm, has escaped untouched, though in her features she should pretend gladness, will really be sorry. Yeah, it's the same lines I read up at the very top of the episode. If your nice guy fake tears don't work, then it's time to turn to violence. Jesus, that is what Ovid is saying here. Like, though he's working to convince the men under his instruction that while it may look and feel like violence, like, actually she wants it. Like, the horror, truly, cannot be understated. Violence is, we all well remember, exactly what Thyestes resorts to. I can't even bring myself to revisit that story again, but you can listen to the depraved horror show that it is, either by my reading of Book 6 of Metamorphoses, or for the episode I did for past spooky season. That's how horrifying it is. On horrific and traumatic transformations. Instead, we're going to look at this trick being utilized by another poet from Ovid's time. That time of Augustan so-called morals that seems to easily lend itself to Ovid's pickup artistry. What we're going to look at is from Thyestes, and features none other than Achilles as the violent perpetrator. But before you worry that I'm going to blow up your love of Achilles and Patroclus, remember that this text is very of its time. This is not really the Achilles of the Iliad. Like, it's the Achilles of at least 600 or 700 years later, an Achilles with imperial Roman Augustan values. But first, this same imperial Roman Achilles is named very clearly in the Ars Amatoria itself as an example. What are you doing, descendant of Aeacus? The wool is no task of yours. Do you seek glory by other arts of Pallas? What have you to do with work baskets? Your hand is fitted for holding the shield. Why hold the allotted flax in your right hand, by which Hector shall fall? Spurn those spindles enwrapped in the laborious warp. The lance from Pelion is to be brandished by that hand. By chance, in the same chamber, there was a royal maiden. In her own undoing, she found that he was a male. By force, indeed, was she overcome, so we must believe, but still by force was she willing to be overcome. Many a time did she say, "Stay," when now Achilles was hastening to depart, for, the distaff laid aside, he had assumed valiant arms. Where now is this violence? Why, with gentle voice, Didamia, do you detain the perpetrator of your disgrace? As indeed there is shame in first beginning at any time, so it's pleasing to the fair to submit when the other takes the initiative. Yeah, that's just Achilles straight up raping a woman. And anyway, this is the Achilles before the war. when his mother Thetis places him on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl, in order to keep him from being brought to the war at all. And this is Ovid's pickup artist manual criticizing Achilles for doing womanly things, for hiding his manhood behind the silly crafts of ladies. He recalls when Achilles was found out, and that's when he raped Didamia. But as Ovid makes very clear here, Didamia wanted it, even if she said she didn't. Yeah. In terms of this part of the story, most of the detail that survives comes from a Roman epic poem called the Achilleid by Thyestes. He's the guy who wrote the Thebaid that we've talked about a handful of times on the show, but this is all about Achilles. We often hear this bit of the story, like how he was concealed on Skyros as a girl, but we don't often get the reminder that, at least in this Roman work where, this survives in any detail, he's a fucking menace while he's there. If the Roman poet Tatius wasn't directly influenced by Ovid's art of love, then the concept of sexual violence being a useful means of achieving what a man wants was widespread enough in the Roman world that, he might as well have just lifted it right from Ovid. Achilles, you see, he gets bored of pretending that he's a lady when he's, hiding out on Skyros. He gets restless, hiding himself away in the guise of a woman. Women do boring things. But it's not just the hiding, obviously. It is this womanliness. He's Achilles, and here he is spending years pretending to be a girl. You can almost watch his toxicity grow. And the language is, so eerily similar to Ovid's Ars, as Achilles turns to not only wanting Didamia, but wanting her regardless of whether she wants him back. His texts, though, are also the scream of... Yeah, get ready. They scream of the friend zone. The type of nice guy who's nice because he wants something, who pretends to be a woman's friend because he assumes it will lead to sex, only to complain about being put in the friend zone when it turns out that she doesn't want him. Dude, it turns out that's just friendship, you piece of shit. Anyway, the type of guy who gets ragey when that happens, that is Tatius's Achilles. Because he first tries to seduce Didamia while he is still disguised as a girl. Seemingly, from the moment he arrives, he's, at her. And later, when she finds out the truth about him, he keeps going. But even still, no matter what he tries, it doesn't work. Because Didamia is just, she just thinks he's her friend. She just thinks they're friends. He's been there for years, long enough that she sees him as a brother. Until finally she realizes what's going on. But by then it's too late. This is from the Achilleid. It's a little abridged by me. For when Achilles, rough as he was, stood amid the maiden company, and the departure of his mother rid him of his artless bashfulness, straightway, although the whole band gathers round him, he chose her as his comrade, and assails with new and winning wiles her unsuspecting innocence. Her he follows, and persistently besets. Toward her he ever and again directs his gaze. Now too zealously he clings to her side, nor does she avoid him. Now he pelts her with light garlands, now with the baskets that let their burden fall, now with the thyrsus that harms her not. Or again he shows her the sweet strings of the lyre he knows so well, and the gentle measures and songs of Chiron's teaching, and guides her hand and makes her fingers strike the sounding harp. Now as she sings he makes a conquest of her lips, and binds her in his embrace, and praises her amid 1,000 kisses. She marvels at the deep tones of his voice, how he shuns all her fellows, and pierces her with too attentive gaze, and at all times hangs breathless on her words. And now he prepares to reveal the fraud, but she, like a fickle girl, avoids him, and will not allow him to confess. Even so, beneath his mother Rhea's rule, the young prince of Olympus gave treacherous kisses to his sister. He was still her brother, and she thought no harm, until the reverence of their common blood gave way, and the sister feared a lover's passion. And I'm really interested in what you were talking about the burial sites,
Right.
because you maybe a little, just reiterate some of that, unfortunately, but I'm really curious in how they might connect to the wider Mediterranean, because it sounds a lot like what the Egyptians did, kind of thing.
Yes. So it seems as if the in the whole mortuary sphere was an area of sort of peer competition, and maybe even room for mobility, upward and downward mobility within the social classes. And many of the elites spent a tremendous amount of time on their burials. So well before they died, there were large tombs that were being constructed that would take, many years to construct. And then there was this strong tradition of multiple burials that is a way to transfer power from one generation to the next. So you are, on the one hand, maybe you're vying for power, but you want to make sure that power lasts into the next generation. And one way you do that is by creating like a power structure among your family or your clan, that by being buried with someone that was powerful before, that shows a kind of endorsement. And then also the display, the funeral, the gifts, the honors that are given to the dead by the living is a transfer of power to those living individuals. So we think that's one reason that there's, unlike the Egyptians, who luckily tell us in text what they believed, that they had this, what you take in your tomb, you need because you're going to need it in the afterlife.
Yeah.
And sometimes we assume that's the case with the Mycenaeans, but knowing from later Greek mythology and religion, we know that they had a very different sense of what the afterlife was like. And that may have already been the case in this early period, which suggests to us that the elaborate display of goods at the time of the funeral and that were then put into the burial with the dead had more to do with the living than it had to do with the dead.
Yeah.
That it showed their status, their ability to have more of this. We always call it conspicuous consumption, because you take all this valuable material and you bury it in the ground and you don't give it to the next generation.
Yeah.
So they're transferring status, but the message is, I have this wealth. I don't need to keep it for myself. I can emphasize the power and wealth of my father, ancestor, whatever, by actually giving all these things as part of a display that all of you folks see, that I'm doing this, and that means all of that is transferred onto me. At the same time that I have enough, I don't need that. I have enough to keep going and be even better. So it's this really weird thing. It's hard for us, I think, to conceive of that the arena of death and burial can be so important to social hierarchy and the succession of power and status. But it really seems to be hugely important. And that's one reason they expended so much energy and labor and resources on their tombs, first of all, but then also on their funerals and their burials. And for generations, they came back to these tombs. They would move around the dead. They would do all kinds of different interesting traditions with those that are already dead. And then new burials would go into that same location. So this emphasis on multi-generational tombs translates into that sort of handing on power and status through the dead back to the living.
That is so interesting. Now, are these like the beehive tombs that we know of from the region, or do those come later?
No, those are exactly the beehive tombs. Now, when you were there, you probably saw a couple of them, but you may not have seen the earliest, because at Mycenae we have 9 of them.
Yeah.
And 6 of them belong to the pre-palatial period.
Oh, wow.
And honestly, I would say the last group of 3, the first 2 of those 3 were probably built one right before there were palaces, maybe was started to be built, and the other one was right at the start. So even the ones that were built later are still quite early in the whole sequence of things, because then they keep being used. And so we think we have as many as 6 or 7 families, very high elite families, that have the resources to build these beehive tombs out of these giant stones. And, an architectural and engineering miracle that that they could,
incredible.
with the beehive shape and the corbelled vaulting and the fact that several of them survive till today, that kind of thing. But beyond that, we also have what we often refer to as the middle class tombs, but it's actually a wider range than that, what we call chamber tombs. And the main difference is they are carved out of the bedrock and not lined with masonry, the way the beehive tombs are. Right. And they can be in all different shapes. They can be circular, oval, square, rectangular. There are a number of them from around the time that the beehive tombs, or what we call the Tholos tombs, when they were built, that are circular. So they're imitating in some ways the shape of these ones, these very, very high elite ones. Yeah. And many of them, not only at Mycenae, but in other sites around in the area that we think was under Mycenae's control, have some spectacular chamber tombs. They are huge. You could drive a bus into them. They're just really, really big. And many of them, unfortunately, of course, have been looted, like the Tholos tombs. But we have some that were excavated early in the late 19th century that have material we think equal to what may well have been in some of the Tholos tombs.
Wow.
So it's like maybe the next tier, or maybe it's a choice to do one type rather than another. And we see that, over time, more and more tombs are built. And by the time you get to the palatial period, you'll have in one group of tombs, because they exist in all of these different cemeteries, you'll have ones that are big, giant early ones, and then you'll have sort of regular sized later ones, and you'll have some that are used over 500 years and some that are newly used after the palatial period starts. So it's a whole mishmash of what we think probably a whole clan would have been like over all of these many generations. And they keep returning back to the same tombs. And if not the same cemetery, they build new tombs in the same cemetery.
Wow. They're just so big. Like, when I stepped in one of those Tholos tombs, like, I nearly lost my mind. Like, I have not been that excited in many other places. Like, and the sound in them, the acoustics, oh my God, I dream about it. But I'm just I'm impressed that they are early. And like, what kind of time period?
Like what in round numbers, calendar numbers, what are we talking about? For the early Mycenaean period, it probably starts as early as 1700, 1600 BCE. Okay. And then the palaces start sometime after 1400 BCE. Oh, wow. So we have 250, 300 years. Yeah. Which they're going from already. They're in the country. They're what we call the Middle Helladic period, or the Middle Bronze Age. And then they begin to develop this more social structure, more hierarchy, and that goes over these generations. The beehive tombs themselves, the first 6, we think date to between 1500 and 1400 BCE. And then the last 3 date somewhere between probably 1400 and maybe 1250.
Right.
Somewhere in that range.
Pretty
the last
soon
3.
Before the
they start right at the start of the palace period, and then there's one that seems to be kind of the last one that's constructed, was probably very much in the height of the palace, like during that period. Yeah.
Oh, it's so interesting, especially now that I have, spoken with people about the collapse itself, just time period wise, and like imagining, the last one being, like less than a century, I gather, like kind of before the sort of end in whatever way that they did end. Yes. During the Bronze Age collapse. So it's interesting I'm just sort of imagining the idea that things went so badly that they weren't able to continue using the tombs, even for those who died, right around the collapse. It was like they weren't going to be able to prioritize, doing the big show what was happening.
And we think that potentially the reason why we have fewer later of the ones, the Tholos ones with the masonry, is that people didn't have the access to the labor or to the resources to expend on that. Their focus was elsewhere.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of things going on in that 13th century that suggest to us that all through that century, things were starting. The collapse doesn't happen for another 100, 150 years, depending where you are. But the palace itself is struggling, and that it's not gonna make it into the next century as a political structure, that things are going to change so radically after that. But it's clear that the mortuary sphere, once power is really consolidated into one group, they don't need that same kind of competitive display that was so important for hundreds of years before then.
Oh, it's just, I love this so much. So I'm really interested in how, because I'm really familiar with the statuary and stuff that comes out of like the Minoan period, or like the Minoans are earlier than this, and the Cycladic people and everything, and basically I want to talk about all the goddess figurines that they have, which I don't know if we did the Mycenaeans have a kind of equivalent? Do we know much about like the sort of more religious aspects like we do of the Cycladic and Minoans?
We do. It develops in the early palatial period. It seems to be developing as a combination of long established belief systems, and apparently the pantheon of gods that we know later came with them to Greece. But they must not have done much iconographically. They didn't think, whether they didn't think of their gods as humans, or they didn't, or in a human form, or they didn't feel like they needed to show them that way. So when they come into contact, and very strong and sustained contact, with the Minoans, they begin to adopt their iconography that they use. And a lot of it is even through small finds, gold rings, ivory statuary, some small scale stuff, primarily seal stones, that for the most part were likely produced by Minoan artists anyway. Many of them were probably produced for Mycenaean consumers, but initially by Minoan artists. So they produced the same kind of iconography that they did before. What we see happen during the palatial period is let's say a mobilization of religious rituals to once again kind of keep power and to distribute their status, the love light of their status, to the more general population. It was a way, and of course this is true throughout time and history, that religion can be used as a tool to control the masses, right? So I know, shocking. So we see
today on Easter.
I know, it's terrible. Good Friday and all that. It's interesting that we know from later on being 1200, right? The documents in Linear B that we have surviving from Pylos in 1200. We know that there was a Zeus and there was a Poseidon, and we know all these male gods, right? We still don't really have any images of anyone on the mainland that we can point to and say, there's a god. We don't. It's still predominantly the female deities, but there are a huge plethora of them in the documents as well. So it's not like they brought them in from somewhere else. No, they had plenty. They just kind of said, oh, look, these people put them in pictures. We could do that. We could show some of these pictures. But it's very at the start of the palatial period, when it looks like the idea of a palace was actually transported to the mainland from Crete.
Yeah.
And they're like, we could have one of these large centralized architectural features. Doesn't look like it does on Crete, but that's okay, because we have our own preferences in architecture. That they develop one object that is for consumption and libation. So they develop a standard drinking vessel that's very simple, very easy to make. Actually, they make tens of thousands of them, not very well, but it's fine. And we see them suddenly start to be used in all kinds of ritual activities, in life and death, in the houses, and all over. And then at the same time, we have the development of terracotta figurines. And you may have seen some of these before. There are a whole bunch of types, but there are two general categories. One of them is a female, predominantly female figurines, and the other predominantly bovine figurines. So maybe bulls, they have horns, but they don't have genitalia. So, we have to say, well, we don't know, because cows can have horns. But I suspect they're probably meant to be viewed as the male animal. So the female human, the male animal, very likely representing fertility among humans and animals.
Sounds
representing
like Crete too.
strength. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But these are things that the Minoans who had terracotta figurines,
Yeah.
who exclusively really in sanctuary sites, these are very different in the way they're made, the way they're decorated, and the fact that we find them everywhere. I would say the modern equivalent, although my students don't seem to know what this is, so they must not be doing it anymore, but my modern equivalent was always a rabbit's foot.
Oh,
The
yeah.
kind of thing that people would have on their keychain and you carried around with you.
Yeah.
And it meant luck. It meant that it was some kind of talisman.
Yeah.
And it may be that these figurines are good luck in your family, good luck for your children, good luck for your fertility, good luck for your crops and your animals and everything that you needed to survive. And we do find them in some religious contexts, but again, and they very likely mean there's something symbolic there, but we find them all over houses and all over trash pits. When they got broken, they weren't kept or repaired. They were thrown away. So they just become ubiquitous. They're kind of everywhere. And again, between these two objects, they seem to have a kind of standardized ritual practice that everyone can participate in. But they're probably being made in large scale at places like the palaces for distribution, to enfranchise people in the religion, to sort of bring them in and have them participate in at least a symbolic way with the stuff that the upper echelon are doing.
Yeah.
And that's a way to curry favor. And we know also from the Linear B tablets that the palace would help supply important religious festivals, that they would provide beef, large on the hoof beef for sacrifice, and then for the feast itself. They would give wine and oil and metal vessels and these sort of splashy, showy things that they could send to the site of a festival, even if we don't know people wise who was there, but they're showing a village full of their subjects, as it were, the people they rely on to pay their taxes and provide food and all those kinds of things, providing them a sort of symbolic status by here's the palace making this happen. Our food's better, our wine's better. We have enough for all these people. And here they're going to give us this really crappy cup. No offense, Starbucks, for your not crappy cup, but that if some of them are even kind of have holes in them, like they probably didn't even work right. But the fact that you were given one and you probably made a toast and you probably drank and you probably poured out some of the liquid for the gods, and you probably took it home with you.
Yeah.
That was just this really powerful, successful way that for more than about 200 years, the palace kept people engaged in what was going on. And I think they felt beholden then to turn around and say, oh yeah, I will pay my taxes. I will send, 15% of my wool that I produce on my farm to the palace. And what do I get back for it? Well, I get protection if needed. I get to participate in this fun religious stuff. I get some good meat and some good wine. So it was obviously a barter economy anyway. But it was an interesting way to use, again, standard across time and space, to use religion in a way to keep a kind of standard culture.
Yeah.
And keep people in line, at the same time to make them feel like they're worthwhile. And whether they were or not, that's another question, but it fostered that feeling that you belonged to this kingdom and to this culture. And so therefore, I mean, theoretically, if then the Wanaks turn around and said, okay, I need all of you to be in an army and go, possibly die, you were more prepared to do that because of this, all your life generational relationship that was fostered with the central place and the central authority.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for listening to this compilation of we talk about so many cool things. Michaela and I work on so many incredible topics and everything these days. It's just such a joy. And so enormous thank you to Michaela for putting together this series of clips. I bet they were great because I recorded them at some point over the last few years of this podcast, and thus they're good work. As always, the podcast is written and hosted by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians, and today she put together all of the clips for this episode. Thank you, Michaela. You are a joy. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcasts network. Listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Liv, and oh, I do love this shit. 7 years running.